Hello, this is Dr. Fernández Santiago recording her intervention from her office in the University of Granada entitled Vulnerable, Intersecting Disability and Precarity in the Fourth Industrial Revolution, the case of Mr. Robot. In 2015, USA Network released Sam Esmail's Mr. Robot, an original series in 4 seasons ending in 2019 that tells the story of Elliot Alderson, a young hacker working in cybersecurity who develops the alternative personality of a Mr. Robot to bring evil corps or E-corps financial oppression over American people down with the help of a group of hackers who call themselves the Fox Society or F Society. However, from the very beginning, the audience knows that Eliot's reasons to fight E-Corp are not entirely political, but rooted on the traumatic experience of his father's death, which was caused by E-Corp's environmental malpractice. Drawing on the psychological aspects of the doppelganger literary theme that goes back to popular titles of 19th century Gothic traditions such as Frankenstein, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, or The Picture of Dorian Gray, Esmail's series presses on the disabling effects that the Fourth Industrial Revolution has on individuals as well as the economic precarity it creates on the American working class. A case of vulnerable narrative, as defined by Jean Ganteau in 2015, Mr. Robot exploits the device of narrative prosthesis, defined by Mitchell and Snyder in 2000, to explore the possibilities of individual and social resilience in an increasingly virtual world and the very material effects on its embodied realities. Like in the Gothic literary production that developed during the First Industrial Revolution, Mr. Robot presses on the intersecting vulnerabilities that technological developments such as galvanism, chemistry, art, or digitalization produce while reconfiguring the limits of human identity and social structures. Also, like its 19th century predecessors, this series combines a strong popular appeal and a sophisticated formal perfection that relies heavily on complex soliloquy as a form of narrative and deep philosophical elaboration. In 2016, Klaus Schwab, founder and president of the World Economic Forum, defined the Fourth Industrial Revolution as the culmination of emerging technologies, fusion into the physical, digital, and biological worlds. As everything gets connected to everything, not only technologies to other technologies, but also biological organisms and hardware to digital code, Luciano Floridi envisions the Fourth Industrial Revolution as a context where the real and the informational merge. This is the context of Sam Esmail's series, where the digital and the physical merge through a radical openness to alterity that in the case of E-Corp is envisioned through diverse converging companies and interests operating globally. And in the case of taxable doppelganger Elliot Alderson, I say taxable doppelganger for the way it is named also, as you can notice the euphonic repetition in his name L.R. evoking the characters of William Wilson or Humbert Humbert, and also the pun in older as alter. As I was saying, this radical openness to alterity is also envisioned in the case of Elliot Alderson and represented through the converging subjectivities that Elliot and Mr. Robot develop. In the series, both cases, E-Corp's and Elliot's, also merge as the cause of Elliot's child trauma is traced back to his father's death of a leukemia caused by E-Corp's environmental malpractice. Elliot's identity blends with the corporation as he becomes its employee in data security, and like the rest of employees and customers, he is regarded by the corporation as a mere data. Still, it is precisely because Elliot's identity results from his fusion between the physical and the digital that he can become a threat to the corporation's data security, which he does by creating a society. In 2018, Skildon and Havsepi identified the risks and vulnerabilities that individuals were subject to by welcoming connection to and fusion with the radical alterity of digital technologies, which include socioeconomic and environmental factors, the end of privacy, social imbalance caused by computer literacy, and vulnerabilities related to health and wealth distribution, as well as to existential unhappiness and meaninglessness. In 2004, in the context of 9/11, Judith Butler related vulnerability to the visualization of the precarious and unstable life conditions of those whose lives did not matter. Visualizations, she argued, would help diminish their precarity by making them matter. Like Butler's depiction of vulnerability, disability has also been theorized as a social construct that discriminates people with physical or psychological particularities that are defined as impairments by medical discourse. In both cases, discrimination is enforced by merging the physical and the discursive informational. In Mr. Robot, the fusions of the physical and the technological enforces precarious conditions on individuals that relate to wealth distribution and lifelong debt, degraded environmental conditions, labor exploitation, poor health, derelict housing, pervasive surveillance of people's privacy, and computer illiteracy. Also, the merging of the real and the virtual has disabling effects on the human body and mind, which are depicted in the series through the character of Elliot as extremely vulnerable to physical and psychological trauma. As he experiences social phobias, extreme pain and addictions, and surrenders his life to the control of medical institutions that confine and isolate him. Let me read a beautiful quote where Elliot is talking to his alter ego or doppelganger, this Mr. Robert that he's fused with, and it says, I quote, "You are not real," Elliot tells Mr. Robert. "What, you are? Is any of it real? Look at it. A well-built fantasy, synthetic emotions in the form of pills, psychological warfare in the form of advertising, mind-altering chemicals in the form of food, brainwashing seminars in the form of media, controlled, isolated bubbles in the form of social networks. Real? You want to talk about reality? We haven't lived in anything remotely close to it since the turn of the century. We turned it off, took out the batteries, snacked on a bag of GMOs while we tossed the remnants in the ever-expanding dumpster of the human condition. We live in branded houses trademarked by corporations built on bipolar numbers jumping up and down on digital displays, hypnotizing us into the biggest slumber mankind has ever seen." End of quote. The series abounds in scenes exploiting Rami Malek's acting skills in expressing physical and psychological suffering. As Elliot strives to cope with these experiences and make sense of his life in the context of the Fourth Industrial Revolution, he is deprived of a meaningful and happy life. In Esma's series, these vulnerabilities find expression through a corresponding narrative vulnerability. In 2015, Zhang Gantou identified 4 main generic or model constellations typifying what he calls the poetics of vulnerability, which include the first one, witnessing as a powerful experience that acts on the subject and of which individuals and groups become the hostages. The second one, openness to failure and uncertainty as the modality of anti-totalization following an ethics of care. Third one, images of the body and of bodily frailty that are presented as the most basic common denominator of humanity, signaling the temporal disarray of the scar. And finally, the performative nature of the vulnerable text, as it is perceived by the reader. Mr. Robot also exploits these narrative vulnerabilities as narrative theses for a greater spectacularity as they fuse with human precarity and disability in the context of the Fourth Industrial Revolution. As a vulnerable narrative, Mr. Robot exhibits all the features listed by Gantou. Eliot's homodiegetic voice-over oscillating between the monological, soliloquial, and dialogical, with an extreme lyricism, I must say. This complex personality, converging personalities, are testimonial of his traumatic experience, which is narrated through flash forwards and flash backwards, memory lapses, and personality switches that build into uncertainty as the text fails to communicate a coherent storyline. The lyrical in the soliloquial, I would say, that we can discuss this later after you ask your questions, is expressive of emotion and of an internal truth that gives voice to trauma. I would like to read a very beautiful passage just to illustrate how, to be a TV series, it gets really poetical, the voiceover. Eliot says, like a hot drive blasted by excessive voltage, my mind is frayed, close to fried. I can feel the static running through my brain, serotonin receptors working overtime. It's kind of beautiful, and also the metaphors he uses to describe his brain activity all come from the digital world. Another quotation referring to memory lapses, where Eliot just does the same in blending his biological human experience with the digital. There is a moment when he's trying to remember his life as a child. He goes back to his old family house where he grew up. He goes there trying to remember how his childhood was, but when he gets there, he finds a piece of paper stapled in this wooden lamppost that only reads error 404 not found, which is what a computer tells you when it cannot find a file that is lost. So it blends the physical and the digital worlds to imply an error caused by lost data. And Eliot is here speaking computer language, not human language, not English. It's just computer language, the way he relates to his own memories. So this textual uncertainty, where the text fails to communicate a coherent storyline with its flash forwards and flash backwards, is performative in the sense that it causes in the audience a similar mimesis of effect that Ismail's narrative exploits to build plot tension and sustain attention, as well as to resist totalization following the ethics of care. Let's see, another quotation which Eliot is directly addressing this you that the audience can identify with, but we're not really sure who this you is, considering the end of the series that I'm not going to disclose here. This you could be several people or personalities. Well, regarding how Eliot projects, or the text projects, this vulnerability onto the audience and makes it performative in creating the same effect as he is experiencing, Eliot says, "I wish I could be an observer like you. Then I could think more calmly. This is comfortable, less stressful. In fact, I feel like I can see everything now. Everything this way. Do you know more than me? That wouldn't be fair. My imaginary friend knowing more than me. So what do you know?" Hmm? Then Elliot decides what he's going to do, but in fact, it is the imaginary friend who does, because there is no difference for him. The audience is also Elliot. But at the end of the series, in season 4, episode 13, the whole narrative is revealed as a case of narrative prosthesis that draws on Eliot's psychological disability and rewards the audience with a narrative closure against Ganto's premises of narrative vulnerability. But I will leave this for the final questions with a spoiler warning for those who have not watched the series, because in this episode, all these inconsistencies and uncertainties about the many personalities that blend within Eliot and the whole series is kind of revealed. We can, like I said, discuss that later. So thank you very much for your attention.